The monitors hummed steadily in Tulsa County as a 13-year-old girl sat upright, fully conscious, refusing every meal for 7 days, while her organs began shutting down. Elowen Calder had access to anything wealth could provide, specialists flown in from 3 states, but nothing explained why she had chosen starvation over survival. Her billionaire father signed every authorization, funded every test, and every expert failed. When a maid arrived from Kansas carrying nothing but a chipped yellow mug that belonged to her dead son, something impossible happened. The girl finally spoke, and what she revealed shattered every assumption about grief anyone in that house had made. She wasn't starving because of her mother's death in a highway accident outside Salina. She was waiting for her father, the man who had been unreachable overseas when it happened, to tell her it was allowed to keep living. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe now, because what happens next will redefine everything you thought you understood about absence. The monitors hummed evenly in the private wing at St. Francis Hospital in Tulsa County, tracking a pulse that refused to dramatize itself. Oxygen saturation holding steady at 97%. Blood pressure textbook normal for a 13-year-old girl who had not swallowed food in 7 days. Elowen Calder sat upright against the leather-backed bed, lips cracked white at the edges, eyes open and focused on nothing in particular. A breakfast tray cooling untouched on the wheeled table beside her left hand, steam long gone from the oatmeal, condensation dried from the orange juice glass. The attending physician stood near the doorway with a tablet angled away from the light, scrolling through labs that continued to make no sense, because everything looked survivable, except the part where survival required eating, and eating had simply stopped. Her father's name was engraved on the hospital's East Expansion Wing, stamped into donor plaques in 3 separate lobbies, credited in the Ophthalmology Center 2 floors down, and none of that inheritance had produced a single answer worth repeating out loud. By day 3, the problem had already moved past Tulsa. A pediatric gastroenterologist flew in from Dallas, with a reputation built on solving the cases other specialists referred out. Spent 6 hours running scopes and motility studies, found nothing, and left behind a recommendation to consult psychiatry. A neurologist arrived from Cook County in Illinois the following morning, ordered a full cranial MRI and autonomic testing, reviewed the images twice, then suggested they recheck thyroid function, even though the labs had already cleared. On day 5, a childhood trauma consultant drove overnight from Johnson County, Kansas, her briefcase still carrying road salt from the turnpike, and she sat across from Elowen for 90 minutes asking questions that went unanswered, her clinical training no match for a silence that felt less like refusal and more like a choice made too far back to reverse. The consultations stacked like failed blueprints, each one precise, each one useless, and the only thing anyone agreed on was that the body would tolerate this for another 72 hours before the damage became irreversible. What no one could explain was why a girl with access to anything money could airlift into Oklahoma had decided that nothing was safer than swallowing. The problem stopped belonging to Tulsa County by the time the second round of consultations began, spreading across state lines not through contagion but through failure. Each specialist's inability to diagnose pulling in someone else with credentials 1 tier higher, 1 city farther out, 1 reputation more specialized. Marrow Calder signed transfer authorizations without reading them, approved expenses that would have funded a wing renovation, chartered flights that carried doctors who arrived with theories and left with apologies. The endocrinologist from Baylor Medical Center in Dallas brought equipment that measured hormone cascades down to the picogram, ran panels that tested for conditions so rare they appeared in textbooks as footnotes, and found nothing that would explain why a body with functioning insulin production and normal cortisol rhythms had simply decided to stop processing food. She left behind a recommendation to explore autoimmune triggers, which the immunologist from Northwestern Memorial in Cook County, Illinois, had already ruled out 3 days earlier after running antibody screenings that came back so clean they looked like control samples. The psychiatrist who drove down from Kansas City spent an afternoon observing Elowen through the window before entering the room, watching the way her gaze stayed fixed on the ceiling tiles, tracking her stillness for signs of catatonia or dissociative breaks. And what she found instead was presence. A girl who was entirely conscious and entirely committed to a decision no one else could access. She wrote, "elective food refusal without clear precipitating trauma" in her notes, which was clinical language for admitting she had no idea what was happening, and suggested they consult a specialist in selective mutism out of Philadelphia. Even though Elowen wasn't mute, she just had nothing left to say. By day 8, the hospital's ethics committee met quietly in a conference room overlooking the Arkansas River, discussing intervention thresholds and legal boundaries around a minor who was technically capable of making medical decisions, but whose choice was effectively terminal. The word hospice appeared in a draft memo that never got sent. Blood work continued to come back pristine. Scans still showed no obstruction, and the only thing deteriorating was time itself, which moved slower in that room than anywhere else in the building. If medicine had a mechanism for this, someone would have found it by now. What they found instead was a silence that refused to be categorized, a body in rebellion against every framework they had for understanding it. The discharge papers were signed on a Thursday morning, not because Elowen had improved, but because the hospital had run out of procedurally defensible reasons to keep her, and Maro Calder's legal team had made it clear that if medicine couldn't intervene, then surveillance served no purpose. The transport back to the estate outside Bartlesville happened in a private ambulance with a cardiac monitor that beeped steadily the entire 40-minute drive north, tracking a heart that refused to acknowledge the crisis it was sustaining. When they carried her through the front entrance, past marble floors imported from Carrara and chandeliers that had been photographed for architectural journals, the house absorbed her the way it had absorbed everything else wealth could purchase, quietly, expensively, without effect. By the second day home, the estate had transformed into a medicalized waiting room where time itself felt like the primary threat. A rotating nursing staff arrived from agencies in Tulsa and Oklahoma City, checking vitals every 4 hours, logging refusals in charts that no one read, their presence turning the second-floor hallway into something that smelled faintly of antiseptic and failure. A nutritionist from Norman drove up twice a week with color-coded meal plans laminated in protective sleeves, explaining caloric density and appetite stimulation techniques to a girl who had already made a decision that existed outside the logic of nutrition science. A speech therapist tried neutral prompts, asking Elowen to describe objects in the room or respond to simple yes-no questions, and received nothing back except a gaze that stayed fixed on the window overlooking the property's eastern tree line. The danger wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with alarms or sudden collapses. It showed up in the way her wrist bones became more visible each morning, in the slight yellowing at the edges of her eyes that the nurse noted but didn't mention, in the hourly logs that documented a body shutting down by degrees so small they only made sense when you looked at the whole week together. If you're watching this, wondering how far a choice can take someone before it stops being a choice at all, subscribe now, because what's coming will rewrite everything you think you understand about silence. Maro Calder spent those days on calls with specialists in Boston and Los Angeles, men and women whose reputations had been built on solving the unsolvable, and every conversation ended the same way, with careful language that admitted defeat without using the word. The maid arrived on a Tuesday afternoon without announcement, sent by a home care agency based in Sedgwick County, Kansas, that normally handled post-surgical recoveries and elder transitions, not crisis interventions in estates where the staff outnumbered the family. Her name was Inés Calderón, no relation to anyone who mattered, mid-40s, with the kind of face that disappeared in crowds, carrying a single canvas bag that looked like it had survived multiple relocations. The head of household staff met her at the service entrance near the kitchen, handed her a schedule that outlined meal prep and light cleaning, and made it clear through tone alone that expectations were low and supervision would be constant. Inés walked through the house without asking for a tour, past the grand staircase with its iron scrollwork imported from a state sale in Virginia, through hallways lined with abstract paintings whose value exceeded most people's annual income, and she moved like someone who had cleaned enough wealth to stop being impressed by it. She found Eloin's room on the second floor without being directed, knocked twice on the doorframe even though the door was already open, and entered with the kind of quiet that felt less like deference and more like decision. The room had been sanitized into something clinical. Medical equipment lined the wall nearest the bed, monitors still plugged in, even though no one was actively tracking them anymore, IV stands folded but ready, a sharps container mounted near the nightstand that hadn't been used since the discharge. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in enough light to see but not enough to make the space feel alive. Eloin lay on her side, facing the window, her breathing shallow but steady, and she didn't turn when Inés entered. What happened next violated every expectation the household had built around solving the problem. Inés didn't bring a tray. She didn't attempt conversation. She didn't position herself as a caregiver or an authority or someone with a strategy that would finally break through where trained professionals had failed. She pulled the chair from the corner of the room, the upholstered one no one had sat in since the furniture was arranged, and placed it 3 feet from the bed, angled so she could see the window Eloin was watching. Then she sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and stayed there until the afternoon light shifted into dusk, and the room grew cold enough that someone from downstairs brought up a blanket she didn't ask for. 3 days passed with a rhythm that felt like mockery to everyone watching. Inés arrived each morning at 7, walked upstairs without checking in with the supervising nurse, and entered Eloin's room carrying nothing except the same canvas bag she had brought on the first day. She folded linens that didn't need folding, wiped surfaces that were already clean, rearranged the medical supplies in drawers with a precision that suggested purpose, but produced no outcome anyone could measure. Then she returned to the chair by the window and sat, sometimes for hours, watching the same tree line Eloin had been staring at since the discharge, and the only sound in the room was breathing and the occasional creak of the house settling into afternoon heat. The household staff gathered in the kitchen during shift changes, voices low but edged with frustration that had nowhere productive to land. The head nurse mentioned to Marrow's assistant that Inés wasn't following any recognizable care protocol, wasn't documenting vitals or attempting nutritional intervention, wasn't even speaking to the girl, and the assistant passed that observation up the chain where it died, because no one knew what to replace her with. The nutritionist from Norman asked directly what therapeutic model Inés was operating under, and when the question reached Inés through a hallway conversation she happened to overhear, she answered that she wasn't operating under anything. She was just there, and the simplicity of that response made people angry in a way they couldn't articulate. By the 5th day, something had shifted in the room that no one could document in a chart or justify in a medical meeting. The air felt different, less like a standoff and more like a held breath, as if the pressure that had been building since Eloin's first refusal had found a way to disperse without actually resolving. The monitors were still there, the IV equipment still staged in case of collapse, the hourly logs still tracked declining body mass, but the room itself had stopped feeling like a battlefield where someone had to win. Inés didn't bring hope. She didn't bring strategy. What she brought was a refusal to treat silence like an emergency that could be solved through force or persuasion. and that refusal changed the texture of waiting from something unbearable into something that might be survived. Elowen still wasn't eating, her wrist bones pressed sharper against skin that had started to look translucent in the morning light. The question wasn't whether inaction was helping. The question was whether it was making space for something no one had thought to allow. The storm rolled in from Osage County on the 6th evening, visible from the second-floor windows as a dark line that swallowed the horizon and moved east with the kind of deliberate momentum that made the air feel heavy before the first drop fell. Thunder pressed low over the property, rattling the older window panes in their frames, and the light outside turned the particular shade of green that comes before serious weather, the kind that makes animals go quiet and sends people indoors with an instinct older than weather forecasting. Inez had been sitting in her usual position near the window when the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the span of a minute, and she stood to close the curtains halfway, not all the way, leaving enough gap that the room wouldn't go completely dark. That was when Elowen's eyes moved, not toward the window where the storm was building, not toward Inez who had just crossed her line of sight, but toward the nightstand where something small and out of place had appeared that morning without explanation. It was a mug, chipped along the rim, painted a faded yellow that had probably been bright decades earlier, with the ghost of a cartoon rabbit still visible on one side, worn nearly transparent from years of handling. Inez had placed it there after cleaning the bathroom, set it down without ceremony next to the untouched water glass and the medication bottles that hadn't been opened since discharge, and she hadn't mentioned it or drawn attention to its presence. The movement was minimal, barely enough to register if you weren't watching closely, but in a room where stillness had become the dominant language, even a shift in focus felt seismic. Elowen's gaze held on the mug for 3 seconds, maybe 4, then returned to the ceiling. But the connection had been made, a line drawn between her attention and an object that had no medical purpose and no obvious relevance to anything happening in that house. The storm hit fully 10 minutes later, rain hammering the roof with enough force that conversation would have been difficult if anyone had been attempting it, and the power flickered twice before the backup generator caught. But the mug stayed exactly where Inez had left it, ordinary and inexplicable, pulling focus in a way nothing else had managed. When the rain finally softened into background static and the room settled back into its usual quiet, Elowen's hand moved 6 inches across the blanket, fingers extending toward the nightstand before stopping, hovering, then withdrawing. Marrow Calder saw the mug when he came in from a conference call with a specialist at the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, someone whose name carried weight in journals focused on pediatric refusal disorders, and the conversation had ended the same way every consultation ended, with careful acknowledgement that the case existed outside established patterns. He stopped in the doorway, still holding his phone, and stared at the object on the nightstand because it violated the carefully maintained aesthetic of the room, cheap and worn, in a space designed to communicate order and expense. He asked where it came from, voice quiet, but carrying the edge that appeared when something in his controlled environment didn't make sense. Inez was folding a blanket near the foot of the bed, and she answered without looking up, explaining in a tone that offered information without invitation that the mug had belonged to her son. She didn't elaborate. She didn't provide context about why it was here or what purpose it served. Marrow waited for more, the silence in the room stretching long enough that continuing to stand there became awkward, and when nothing additional came, he nodded once and left, closing the door with the kind of precision that suggested he was choosing not to pursue something he didn't understand. That night, after Inez had gone, and the house had settled into the particular quiet that comes after 10 o'clock, when even the household staff stops moving through hallways, Elowen reached for the mug again. This time her hand didn't stop. Her fingers touched the curved handle first, traced the chips along the rim where ceramic had flaked away, then moved to the side where the cartoon rabbit had faded into something barely recognizable. Just enough lines left to suggest ears and a face that might have been smiling decades ago when the paint was fresh. She held it for 11 minutes, not lifting it, not turning it, just maintaining contact with something that had survived long enough to lose most of what made it identifiable. The mug didn't fix anything. It didn't make her hungry or break the silence that had kept words locked away since the hospital. What it did was smaller and more dangerous, creating a bridge between her stillness and something outside herself, proof that objects could carry weight that had nothing to do with their function or value. By morning, the mug had moved 3 inches closer to where her hand rested on the blanket, and no one had seen it happen. Inez started talking on the 8th day, not because anyone asked her to, and not because the silence had become unbearable, but because the question Eloin had asked the night before, whispered so quietly it barely registered as sound, had created a space that required filling. The question had been simple: why did you bring it here? Not what it was, or who it belonged to, but why it had traveled from wherever Inez kept her private things into a room where a girl was slowly disappearing. She spoke while looking out the window, hands folded in her lap the way they always were, voice steady in a way that suggested she had said these words before, maybe to herself, maybe to no one. Her son's name had been Mateo. He was buried in a cemetery outside Oxnard in Ventura County, California, a place she had moved away from 6 years ago because proximity to the grave hadn't made loss easier. It had just made it more visible. The mug had been his, purchased at a rest stop somewhere between Los Angeles and San Francisco during a trip they took when he was 7, back when a cheap souvenir felt important enough to carry home and use every morning. He died at 14. Car accident. No one's fault in the way that mattered legally, just physics and bad timing on a road that curved more sharply than expected. She didn't cry while saying this. She didn't frame it as a lesson or position herself as someone who had survived grief in a way that qualified her to guide anyone else through it. What she did was admit that the mug was the only object she had kept that still felt like him, not because it was valuable or meaningful in any ceremonial way, but because it was ordinary enough to have been forgotten, which meant it hadn't been loaded with expectation or turned into a shrine. She brought it because staying in a room where someone was dying slowly required something to anchor her own reason for being there, and the mug reminded her that presence didn't mean saving, it just meant not leaving. Eloin listened without moving, eyes still fixed on the ceiling, but her breathing had changed, slower and deeper, the kind that comes when attention is fully engaged. When Inez finished, the room held the quiet for a long time, long enough that the moment could have dissolved back into silence. But then Eloin spoke again, and what she said rewrote every assumption anyone had made about why she had stopped eating. She said it without preamble, without the careful construction that adults use when trying to make painful things easier to hear. Just the plain statement delivered in a voice that sounded older than 13 because it was carrying something that had been held too long without release. She hadn't stopped eating to make anyone notice. She hadn't stopped eating because she was sick, or because the food tasted wrong, or because she was punishing herself for something she thought she had done. She stopped eating because eating was the last thing she had done with her mother before the accident outside Salina, Kansas, and every meal since then felt like erasing the boundary between that moment and everything that came after. The details came slowly, each one landing with the weight of something that had been examined privately so many times it had worn smooth. 2 winters earlier, February 11th, driving back from a weekend in Kansas City, where they had visited her mother's sister, who lived near the Plaza district. The roads clear until they crossed into Saline County and hit a stretch of Highway 40, where ice had formed in patches too thin to see until tires lost contact with asphalt. They had stopped for lunch at a diner in Salina, the kind with vinyl booths and laminated menus, and her mother ordered pancakes that came with strawberries on top, and they split them, taking turns with the same fork because Elowen had forgotten hers, and they were laughing about something small enough that the specific joke was gone, but the feeling remained. That was the last meal. 40 minutes later, another car crossed the median during a spin-out, and her mother died on impact before the ambulance reached Russell County Medical Center. Every bite Elowen took after that felt like moving forward without permission, like agreeing that life could continue in the same form it had taken when her mother was still in it. The doctors had asked about depression, about trauma responses, about whether she was hearing voices or seeing things that weren't there. But no one had asked if she was trying to preserve something. The refusal wasn't self-destruction. It was the only way she knew to keep the last shared moment from becoming just another meal that faded into the background of a life that kept going. The room absorbed this information the way it had absorbed everything else, quietly. But Inez's face changed in a way that suggested she understood the logic, even if it was unsustainable. Marrow heard the explanation from the hallway, standing just outside the door where he had been waiting to check on something trivial about scheduling, and the dates she mentioned pulled him back to a timeline he had spent 2 years avoiding. February 11th. He had been in Frankfurt that week, finalizing an acquisition through a firm in Hesse that required his physical signature on documents too sensitive to transmit digitally. He had made himself unreachable by design, turning off notifications, routing calls through his assistant, staying in meetings that stretched past midnight because the deal was worth more than whatever else might need his attention. When he finally got the message about the accident, his daughter was already in a hospital in Wichita County, Kansas. His wife was already gone, and the window for being present when it mattered had closed 3 days earlier. What he realized, standing there listening to Elowen explain why she had stopped eating, was that the refusal had never been just about preserving her mother. It had been about waiting for him to come back and tell her it was allowed to move forward, to take the next meal, to let the last moment with her mother become memory instead of anchor. She had needed permission from the person who had been absent when grief arrived, and because that permission never came in a form she could recognize, she had chosen to stay frozen in the space between what was and what couldn't be anymore. Recovery didn't announce itself with breakthroughs or sudden returns to normal. It started 4 days later with a spoonful of broth that Inez prepared without asking, left on the nightstand beside the yellow mug, and Elowen lifted it to her lips while staring at the cartoon rabbit that had worn itself nearly invisible. The meals came unevenly after that, separated by days sometimes, always small, always while holding or looking at the mug, and the weight returned in increments so gradual they barely registered on the scale the nurse checked weekly. Marrow moved his office to the room adjacent to hers, cancelled trips to Chicago and Seattle, stayed in the house in a way he hadn't since before his wife died. But presence felt different now, loaded with the knowledge that he was trying to repair something he had broken by being gone when it mattered most. The photograph of her mother stayed on the dresser. The mug stayed on the nightstand. Nothing was replaced because nothing could be. And one morning, 3 weeks after Inez had first placed the mug in that room, Elowen asked her father a question that neither of them knew how to answer yet.